The Bolivarian National Armed Forces emphatically and unequivocally reject the reprehensible and cowardly kidnapping of citizen Nicolás Maduro Moros, the duly elected constitutional president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, who is also our commander-in-chief, and of his esteemed wife, the First Lady, Dr. Cilia Flores de Maduro. The act was perpetrated yesterday on Saturday, January 3rd of the current year, after he cold-bloodedly murdered a significant portion of his security detail, including male and female soldiers and innocent civilians.
Additionally, in consideration of the decision of the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court of Justice,
dated January 3rd, 2026, through which citizen Delcy Eloina Rodriguez Gomez has been designated as the Executive Vice President of the Republic to temporarily assume all the attributions, duties, and powers in an acting capacity as President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
We fully and unequivocally support the decree establishing a state of external public disturbance throughout the entirety of the national territory which had been previously signed.
In this same spirit, the Bolivarian government will ensure the governance and stability of the nation, and our institution will continue to utilize all of its available capabilities for military defense, the maintenance of internal order, and the preservation of peace. Therefore, we activate throughout the entirety of the national geographic space and in perfect popular military and police fusion the full operational readiness posture, with the aim of integrating the elements of national power into the mission of confronting imperial aggression, thereby forming a single unified combat bloc to guarantee the freedom, independence, and sovereignty of the nation. The Bolivarian National Armed Forces is truly the united and liberating army of this new 21st century.
U.S. officials say Nicolás Maduro is in federal custody in New York. Reuters reports the Venezuelan president is being held at MDC Brooklyn while the U.S. case moves forward. He awaits his first appearance before a U.S. court on charges stemming from a long-running indictment first filed in 2020, including narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and weapons offenses. The Pentagon says Operation Absolute Resolve involved strikes on military sites in Caracas and elsewhere ahead of the capture. The operation has triggered a wave of international condemnation led by Russia, Iran, Cuba, and several Latin American governments. And Trump says the U.S. will oversee Venezuela for now. Critics argue his oil comments suggest resource motives, reinforcing the perception that this was a regime change operation rather than simply a counter-narcotics mission. This is a moment that will be studied for decades. A sitting head of state, captured by a foreign military and brought to face trial in that country's courts. The implications extend far beyond Venezuela. The Pentagon describes a joint extraction in Caracas that captured Maduro and First Lady Cilia Flores. The operation took place around 2 a.m. on January 3rd, according to U.S. officials. It was described as a rapid assault supported by helicopters and special forces. The timing was deliberate. In the early hours of a Saturday morning, just days after New Year's celebrations, when defenses might be at their lowest, Trump and Pentagon communications showed Maduro in custody aboard the USS Iwo Jima, a Navy amphibious assault ship positioned offshore. From there, they flew to the United States. Reports say they arrived at the Stewart airfield north of New York City on Saturday afternoon. The logistics reveal the scale of American planning. Navy vessels positioned in advance, aircraft standing by, and federal agents ready to take custody. This was not an improvised operation. It was months, perhaps years, in preparation. Images aired by major U.S. outlets show Maduro in restraints under U.S. custody. The footage shows him being transferred from aircraft to ground transportation for the journey to New York City. These are striking images. The man who ruled Venezuela for over a decade, now a federal prisoner on American soil. For supporters of the Bolivarian Revolution, these images represent humiliation, the spectacle of their leader in chains. For critics of Maduro, they represent accountability after years of alleged crimes. Maduro was taken to DEA facilities before being transferred to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn on Saturday night, according to reports. The MDC Brooklyn is a federal detention facility that has housed high-profile defendants before. It is where Maduro will await his court proceedings. His first court appearance is expected Monday, when he will be formally read the charges against him. U.S. officials point to a long-running U.S. indictment first filed in 2020. The charges include narco-terrorism conspiracy, conspiracy to import cocaine into the United States, and offenses related to the possession and use of machine guns and destructive devices. The 2020 indictment was announced during the first Trump administration. At the time, it was seen as largely symbolic. Maduro was in power in Caracas, protected by his military and allies, seemingly untouchable. Now, 5 years later, those charges have become the legal basis for his detention. The key jurisdiction is the federal court for the Southern District of New York, the same court that has handled major international drug trafficking cases, including those against Mexican cartel leaders and Colombian drug lords. Prosecutors describe Maduro as the leader of a structure that allegedly used the Venezuelan state to protect and facilitate cocaine trafficking. U.S. filings name Cilia Flores in the case. U.S. officials say she will face court proceedings tied to the indictment. The legal framework for this prosecution raises significant questions. The United States claims jurisdiction based on alleged drug trafficking activities that targeted American territory. Under U.S. law, conspiracy to import narcotics into the United States can be prosecuted regardless of where the defendants are located. The same legal theory has been used against drug traffickers from Colombia, Mexico, and other countries, but applying it to a sitting head of state is unprecedented in modern history. Maduro's defense will likely argue that he is entitled to sovereign immunity, that as head of state, he cannot be prosecuted in foreign courts. The U.S. government will argue that drug trafficking and terrorism charges are not covered by sovereign immunity, and that Maduro's alleged crimes put him outside the protection normally afforded to heads of state. And these legal arguments will play out in the Southern District of New York in the coming weeks and months. The military operation was significant in scale. The Pentagon says more than 150 aircraft were involved to cover the operation. Details on specific targets were not fully laid out publicly. The operation began around 2 a.m. Caracas time on January 3rd. U.S. officials describe strikes on military sites in Caracas and elsewhere. U.S. officials describe a large air umbrella for the raid. Independent confirmation of Venezuelan air defense impacts is limited. The Pentagon and military advisors describe it as a massive joint military and law enforcement operation that lasted less than 1 hour on Venezuelan territory. The operation was designed to surprise, disorganize, and capture Maduro before he could be evacuated or hidden. The speed was remarkable. From first strikes to extraction, the operation was over before Venezuelan forces could mount an organized response. This suggests extensive intelligence preparation and detailed planning. Military analysts are examining what the operation's scale reveals about American capabilities and intentions. More than 150 aircraft is a substantial commitment of resources. It suggests the U.S. military wanted overwhelming force to ensure success and minimize risk. The use of Navy vessels as staging platforms indicates careful coordination between military branches. The rapid extraction and transfer to U.S. territory shows pre-positioned legal and security infrastructure. Some analysts compare the operation to previous U.S. actions in Panama in 1989, when American forces captured Manuel Noriega. That operation, Just Cause, also involved the capture of a head of state on drug trafficking charges. But the scale of absolute resolve appears larger, and the geopolitical context, with Russia and China as Venezuelan allies, makes the stakes considerably higher. Trump says the U.S. will oversee Venezuela for now. Trump stated on social media and in press conferences that the United States executed a large-scale attack against Venezuela and its leader, capturing Maduro and his wife in coordination with U.S. law enforcement agencies. In subsequent statements, Trump said the U.S. will seize the opportunity to repair Venezuelan oil infrastructure and export large quantities of crude to other countries. Critics argue his oil comments suggest resource motives. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, often estimated around 300 billion barrels or more. Critics argue this, not drug trafficking, explains the scale of the operation. The combination of military action and statements about oil has fueled accusations that this was a resource grab disguised as counter-narcotics. Venezuela's oil situation provides crucial context. The country sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, often estimated around 300 billion barrels or more. At its peak, Venezuela was one of the world's leading oil exporters, but production has collapsed in recent years. Mismanagement, lack of investment, U.S. sanctions, and the departure of foreign oil companies have devastated the industry. Where Venezuela once produced over 3 million barrels per day, recent estimates put production at a fraction of that level. Trump's comments about repairing infrastructure and exporting large quantities of crude suggest a plan to revive Venezuelan oil production under American oversight. For critics, this confirms the real motive. For supporters of the operation, restoring Venezuelan oil could benefit both countries and global energy markets. Trump and Republican allies have insisted this is not a war with Venezuela, but rather a targeted action against what they call a narco regime. However, senators and analysts warn that the magnitude of the operation resembles a classic military intervention. More than 150 aircraft involved, strikes on a capital city, extraction of a sitting head of state, statements about controlling the country and its resources. The distinction between counter-narcotics operation and regime change has become increasingly difficult to maintain. Critics point out that the U.S. has a long history of intervention in Latin America, often justified by various pretexts. From Guatemala in 1954 to Chile in 1973 to Panama in 1989, American action in the region has frequently been controversial. Venezuela now joins that list. Inside Venezuela, the most visible faces of the government remain Diosdado Cabello, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, and Vice President Delcy Rodriguez. They have issued messages of defiance, calling for calm and promising resistance against what they call imperialist aggression. Despite Maduro being in U.S. custody, official statements, military speeches, and communications continue to refer to him as constitutional president and commander-in-chief. They maintain that his capture is an illegal kidnapping, not a legitimate change of government. The Venezuelan constitution does not contemplate this situation. There is no provision for a president being forcibly removed by a foreign power. Think tanks and analysts point out that Cabello and Padrino Lopez concentrate real power in the security apparatus and armed forces. Cabello controls significant intelligence and internal security structures. He has long been considered one of the most powerful figures in Venezuela. Some analysts say more powerful than Maduro in certain respects. Padrino Lopez commands the military. His continued loyalty to the Bolivarian government is essential for its survival. The formal figure of Delcy Rodriguez as constitutional successor combines with an effort to project institutional continuity despite Maduro's physical absence. The question is whether this structure can hold, and for how long. Without Maduro, internal power struggles may emerge. Venezuelan officials have been defiant in their response. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez denounced the capture as an illegal and illegitimate kidnapping and demanded Maduro's immediate release. The only president of Venezuela is President Nicolás Maduro, she declared. Defense Minister Padrino Lopez called it the greatest outrage the country has ever suffered and announced full military mobilization. Interior Minister Cabello urged calm but warned Venezuelans not to make things easier for the invading enemy. All three emphasized that Venezuela would resist, but what form that resistance takes remains unclear. Venezuela's options for response are limited. Militarily, Venezuela cannot match American power. The U.S. has overwhelming superiority in air, naval, and ground forces. Any conventional military response would be suicidal. Diplomatically, Venezuela can appeal to international organizations and allies, but the UN Security Council cannot compel the U.S. to release Maduro. Washington holds veto power. Economically, Venezuela has few levers. The country is already under heavy sanctions, and its economy has collapsed. What Venezuela can do is maintain internal resistance, refuse to cooperate with any U.S.-backed transition, and hope that international pressure eventually forces Washington to negotiate. Whether that strategy can succeed is an open question. Russia has led the international condemnation. Moscow called the operation armed aggression against a sovereign state. The foreign ministry said American arguments are untenable and demanded clarification on Maduro's situation. Russia warned that his capture represents an unacceptable interference in Venezuelan sovereignty. Russia has significant interests in Venezuela, including military cooperation and oil investments. Moscow has sold weapons to Caracas and provided technical support for its military. The capture of Maduro is a blow to Russian prestige and influence in Latin America. Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, went further than the foreign ministry. He argued that the events prove any country wishing to protect itself must strengthen its military to the maximum, and that only a nuclear arsenal can guarantee sovereignty. Medvedev closed his statement with words that generated immediate international reaction. Long live nuclear weapons. The statement is being interpreted as a warning, not just to the United States, but to the world. Medvedev's logic is stark. International law did not protect Venezuela. The UN Charter did not protect Venezuela. Diplomacy did not protect Venezuela. Only military power, specifically nuclear weapons, can guarantee that a country's leader will not be captured and taken to a foreign court. Medvedev's argument carries dangerous implications. If nations conclude that only nuclear weapons can protect their sovereignty, the incentive for nuclear proliferation increases dramatically. Countries like Iran, which has long been suspected of seeking nuclear capability, may feel validated. North Korea may use Venezuela as proof that its nuclear program is essential for survival. The non-proliferation framework that the international community has built over decades could be undermined. This may be exactly what Medvedev intends, to frame the Venezuela operation as proof that American power must be countered with the ultimate deterrent. Iran was equally forceful in its condemnation. The Iranian Foreign Ministry described the operation as a textbook example of violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity of any state. Iran called for immediate condemnation from the United Nations and defended Venezuela's right to respond in legitimate self-defense. Tehran reaffirmed its solidarity with the Venezuelan people and government. Iran has its own reasons for concern. Tehran has faced American pressure for decades, including sanctions and threats of military action. The Venezuela operation may heighten Iranian fears about American intentions. China, while more careful in tone, has called for respect for sovereignty and for resolving the crisis through dialogue. Beijing has significant economic interests in Venezuela, including oil investments and loans totaling tens of billions of dollars. China's measured response reflects its complex position. Beijing does not want confrontation with Washington, but it also cannot ignore the capture of a major economic partner. Chinese state media has criticized the operation, but official government statements have been more restrained than those from Russia or Iran. The question is whether China will take more concrete action or whether it will prioritize its broader relationship with the United States. Several Latin American governments, including some critical of Maduro, have expressed concern over the precedent of a U.S. military operation in the region. The question resonates across the hemisphere. If the U.S. can do this to Venezuela, what does that mean for the region? Countries with leftist governments, Bolivia, Cuba, Nicaragua, have condemned the operation strongly. But even countries with more complex relationships with Venezuela have expressed unease. The principle of non-intervention has been central to Latin American diplomacy for over a century. Colombia's response has been notable. President Gustavo Petro urged restraint and pointed to Venezuela's contested legitimacy, reflecting Colombia's complex position on the Maduro government. Colombia shares a long and porous border with Venezuela. It hosts millions of Venezuelan refugees. Any escalation directly affects Colombian security. Petro's call for restraint reflects broader Latin American anxiety about American military action in the region. Colombia has historically been a close U.S. ally. But under Petro, the relationship has been more complicated. His response to the Venezuela crisis will be watched closely. Cuba and Nicaragua have condemned the operation in the strongest terms. Both countries are closely aligned with Venezuela as part of the Bolivarian bloc. They share ideology, economic ties, and mutual support in international forums. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel called the operation an act of imperial barbarism and expressed full solidarity with Venezuela. Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega described it as proof that the empire respects no law. For these governments, Venezuela's fate is a warning. If Washington can act against Maduro, they may wonder if they are next. The crisis is heading to the United Nations. Russia and other countries have called for an emergency session of the UN Security Council to address what they call American aggression against Venezuela. Critics call the operation a dangerous precedent for international relations. The debate will force a public discussion on the legality and consequences of the operation, and it will put on record the international response to what many see as a challenge to fundamental principles of sovereignty. However, the Security Council's power to act is limited. The United States holds veto power and can block any resolution condemning its actions. The UN debate may be more about symbolism and narrative than practical consequences. The question of oil looms over everything. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, often estimated around 300 billion barrels or more. The country's oil infrastructure has deteriorated significantly under years of mismanagement and sanctions. Trump's statement about repairing Venezuelan oil infrastructure and exporting large quantities of crude puts the resource question front and center. Critics in Russia, Iran, and Latin America say this confirms what they always argued. The real objective was never counter narcotics. It was control of Venezuelan oil. Washington insists the operation was about law enforcement and removing a drug trafficking regime. But Trump's own words make that argument harder to sustain. The Venezuela operation joins a long history of U.S. intervention in Latin America. From the overthrow of Guatemala's Jacobo Arbenz in 1954 to support for the coup against Chile's Salvador Allende in 1973, to the invasion of Panama to capture Manuel Noriega in 1989, American action in the region has been controversial. Critics see a pattern. U.S. intervention to remove governments it opposes, often justified by various pretexts. Supporters argue each case was different and that some interventions were justified by legitimate concerns, including drug trafficking, as in the Noriega case. Venezuela now becomes the latest chapter in this contested history. The events in Venezuela raise fundamental questions. If the United States can capture a sitting head of state based on domestic indictments, what does that mean for sovereignty? If military power can override legal protections, what incentive do nations have to follow international rules? Russia's Medvedev has offered one answer. Nuclear weapons are the only guarantee. That argument may resonate with governments that feel vulnerable to American pressure. The risk is a perception that military strength, not international law, is what protects sovereignty. The post-World War II international order was built on principles of sovereignty and non-intervention. Those principles have always been imperfectly applied, but the Venezuela operation may represent a new level of challenge to them. The crisis is far from over. U.S. officials say Maduro is at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, awaiting his first court appearance expected Monday. He faces serious federal charges that could result in life imprisonment. In Caracas, Cabello, Padrino Lopez, and Delcy Rodriguez project defiance and continuity. The military says it remains loyal. Russia circulates nuclear rhetoric. Iran invokes the UN Charter. Latin America watches with concern. Trump says the U.S. will oversee Venezuela and repair its oil infrastructure. The legal proceedings in New York will unfold over months or years, but the geopolitical consequences are already being felt. The shockwaves from Caracas are spreading across the world, and the consequences for Venezuela, for Latin America, and for the international order are only beginning to unfold.